No further ado, I would love to. I'm trying to find the right word. I would love to introduce Dr. Tim Rumage, whose title of Planetary Ethics captures just a little bit of the global view that he has. He's an interdisciplinarian that, that kind of really is covering every corner of the ground. So we're very excited to have him as our host tonight. He works at the corner of science, ecology, art, and design, coming from a field biology background, and he's the coordinator and developer of all the environmental studies at Ringling College of Art and Design. And that's where he teaches courses on environmental science, sustainability, and more. And so what I would love to do is hand it over to you, Tim, and thank you so much. Very excited to have you join us tonight.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the opportunity to. So, as was mentioned, I'm a planetary ethicist, and ethics to me is really about what we do. It's not what we think or feel or believe or intend, but it's actually, what is the stuff that we do, and what do we cause? I mean, so they're starting with some simple questions like, is pollution or the externalities of business, are those things actually ethical to have and to do? Because the reason for doing this is that we do a lot of things that don't really think about the impacts of them. So nobody uses fossil fuel to shrink polar bear habitat or starve penguins or increase asthma attacks in children. In our behavior, we do those things, but in our mind, we don't do those things. I'm just trying to drive to work or get to the store. I'm not thinking about all the other things that happens. The other thing to keep in mind is that the damage is cumulative. And so it's not that the harm is being done by one person. It is not my car that is causing all air pollution, but it is all of us doing all the driving. That is really where the source of the problem starts to come in. The reason for looking at planetary is because that's really the realm in which we work. This image of the Bay Area may be where a lot of you are spending your time, but if you really think about it, this is where we live. That little blue dot is Earth seen from deeper space, and that's the only place in the known universe that can support human life. And so we need to be thinking in terms of how does the planet function, not just how do I function or how does my community function or even my county, my city, my state, my country, but what works in the context of the whole planet. And so part of this conversation is about how do we start to live in concert in context of the planet, because Earth functionally is an island. Whatever is here is what we've got to work with. And if we use that stuff up, then, we don't have any place else to go. So keeping that in mind is a fairly helpful thing to do. Some years ago, Kenneth Boulding wrote an article, The Economics of Coming Spaceship Earth. And in that, he talks about the fact that for most of human civilization, there's always been someplace else to go. We've always had this idea that there was someplace else, if things got bad or difficult in where we lived, we could go someplace beyond where other people were. And that may have been true, but it isn't true now. There is no other place. There isn't any place that isn't impacted already by humans. And so the part of the issue we're really dealing with these days is how do we make that mental adjustment, as well as political, psychological, and in my preference, ethical adjustment to the transition from places unlimited to the fact that we're actually operating in a closed sphere. And we also need to keep in mind how unique humans really are. We are an everywhere species. There is no habitat. We haven't figured out how to be able to live there. We've got people living on mountain peaks. We've got people living in deserts, tropical forests, plains. We also have people who spend months at a time living in tubes underwater. We have had people in the International Space Station for the better part of 20 years. So we've got people living in outer space. We're the only species that makes trash, and we do so purposely. We make things that are designed to be disposed of and not immediately be able to be reused. We're the only species that doesn't live off of local contemporary resources. Okay? For any of us who had a cup of coffee, tea, even a soda today, that stuff didn't come from our area. We're not, I'm here in Bradenton, Florida, near Sarasota. There are no coffee plantations here. There are no tea plantations here. There are no wheat fields here. All of the stuff that we're using is being shipped in from other parts of the world. And another thing we tend to do a lot is we'll get into the economics is that we confuse things that are exchangeable for things that are interchangeable. You can go to the gas station these days and buy $10 worth of gas, and you can go someplace. But putting a $10 bill in your gas tank doesn't get you anywhere. So there is a distinction between exchangeable and interchangeable. And while we are an inventive species, because you got to be fairly inventive. I mean, we have created a mechanism and a food supply in which it's actually possible to use 831 gallons of water to create a cheeseburger. Okay, that takes some real doing. Okay? But the larger issue, especially with ethics, is are we a responsible species? Okay. We know how to genetically modify things, and are we doing a good job with that, or with much of the other technology that we have at our disposal these days? Okay. I mean, last year, it took 110 billion tons of natural resources to run our human world. Okay. On average, every person on the planet uses about 13 metric tons of material just for our lives. Okay? Wealthy nations, of course, use more, about 10 times more. But on average, we're each carrying the responsibility for 13 metric tons worth of material to do the things we do. And those are the kind of things that are issues that are out of our minds most of the time. We don't think about those kind of resources. And so with that sort of huge load of using natural resources, ever since about 1970, we have been in overshoot. We use more material from the Earth in a year than the Earth can actually replace. Last year, Earth Overshoot Day was on the 29th of July. And so as you're looking at this graphic, this is, the safe side is the number of days in which we are operating, within the limits of the Earth. The other side, the red side here, is the number of days we spent in excess of Earth's resources in a year. And the only way that we make this work is every time we go over the line, which actually should be right up in here, we are using up the stocks that we need for the future and accumulating waste. So if you look at carbon dioxide emissions, last year in 2019, the number that was most commonly reported was 3.8 gigatons for fossil fuels. And usually when we see the number of carbon dioxide emissions, people are usually giving us the report about how much is being used as fossil fuels. The actual amount of carbon dioxide that we put in the atmosphere last year, was 43.1 gigatons, 43.1 billion tons. If you include everything we use for fossil fuels, everything we use in the manufacturing of cement, and all the wildfires that were caused by anthropogenic processes. Okay? But numbers like 43 billion tons or something is way beyond our scope of imagining what that is. It's just too big for us to work with. And so what I've done here is I'm going to translate this into adult African elephants, average weight of about 4 tons. So to get 43 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, that is the equivalent of launching 432 elephants into the air every second for an entire year. And I think if people saw 342 elephants being launched into the air, that there'd be a whole different conversation about carbon dioxide. Okay? And especially when you see these elephants hanging around in the atmosphere for, some are going to be up there for decades. Some, about 10% are going to be up there for 1,000 years. And if you just sort of saw the number of elephants over your head increasing on a daily basis, we would really start to take carbon dioxide more seriously. But because it's not really in our perceptual capabilities, we spend a lot of time trying to ignore it or deny it. Physically, the reason we're looking at climate change, we're talking about climate change, is basically because of the increasing levels of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, whether or not it's carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, or fluorinated carbons. These greenhouse gases are what are triggering global warming, leads to climate change, sea level rise, ocean acidification, and some extreme weather events. But I'm going to argue that the real reason for climate change is siloed thinking and our mental disconnect with the life support system upon which we are dependent. Okay? Most of us went through an educational system in which you were taught subjects, but they were always taught in isolation. We have jobs where we're supposed to do and focus on that particular job, but not really go much beyond the boundaries of that job. That's somebody else's job. And so we don't really think in terms of systems, we think in terms really of pieces of the overall puzzle. And that's sort of where we start running into some of the negative interactions that we're having with the environment. We acknowledge and act and design as if everything is connected, or we don't. And for the most part, we've been trained not to think that way, okay? And not to act that way. But we're now at a stage in our population development, our use of resources, that thinking in terms of system is a must. Okay? We accept concepts like waste, pollution, externalities, as real. Okay? We believe things go away. The planet doesn't. Yesterday was trash day in my neighborhood. Put the trash out and it went away. It didn't leave the planet. It just went someplace else. Okay? But a lot of people think about it. It's gone away, and somebody else is responsible for it. Okay? But the boundary that we're all really concerned about is this boundary of the atmosphere. That's the only boundary that really matters from a physical dynamics point of view, and from a pollution point of view, is everything that's trapped inside our atmosphere is what we're going to be confronting. I find with my students, I need to promote curiosity. A lot of them in their school systems, have been trained or rewarded for not asking questions. And we had to get questions back into the process here. So we want to do curiosity because we can't use information we don't have. We cannot evaluate the importance of the unasked question. And we cannot have the wisdom we don't seek. We need to know things and not just assume them. If I were to think about, going to the grocery store today and going to the grocery store when I was a kid, the grocery store looks the same. The products look the same. The backstory of those products is completely different now. Okay? And when I was growing up in Louisville, Kentucky, I pretty much knew where my food was coming from. Now I have no idea. It's a global event. Food comes from, well, we grow peppers and tomatoes here in Florida, but the ones in the store are from Honduras, Nicaragua, France. We're getting apples now from Australia. It's, the backstory of a lot of stuff has changed, but our real thinking has not. So many of the environmental issues we're dealing with are a function of poor, incomplete design, or unverified assumptions, or because we wanted to rush to apply a solution before we really knew all the facts. And we frequently tend to look at symptoms as opposed to causes. What is something I see that is wrong, and how can I fix that, as opposed to looking at what were the contributors that caused that problem, and is there something else that I should actually be doing? So examples that, as climate reality you'll be familiar with. The tendency in business is you've got information and you want to go apply it. Take what we've learned and go make the product, get the profit, as opposed to taking the information and doing some things. What are the implications of using that product or that chemical or the device that we're using to manufacture it? Should we be prototyping this thing and testing it? Do we look at the consequences of that whole collective set of actions? And is that what we really wanted to generate? Before we immediately go over and start applying the material, should we have more awareness and be more responsible for what that stuff can do? A great example, again, for climate reality are CFCs. These were a cost-effective refrigerant, and so they got used as a refrigerant, in air conditions and a lot of other systems. Nobody ran all the consequences or the potentials for what this stuff can do. So we didn't know it was going to create an ozone hole until it created an ozone hole. But we were using these chemicals. They were legal to use. Now I had to go through a whole international process to try to get CFCs to stop being used as coolants. And so that was done, but there was still a need for coolants. And so the CFCs were replaced by hydrofluorocarbons because they're also great coolants. The problem turned out to be, though, because again, we didn't do a full analysis, we just needed a real fast solution, that hydrofluorocarbons are greenhouse gases with a very high global warming potential. And so, we did not come up with a solution. We stopped one form of harm by creating a different kind of harm. And that's a fairly unethical thing to do. So if we look at global warming potential, and I like using this slide because people say, well, show me that climate change, climate warming, global warming is human caused. Well, the hydrofluorocarbons are an easy thing to do because the only way these things exist is we made them. They're all synthetic gases, and we produce them intentionally to be aerosols, to be propellants, to be things we use to spray insulation. We use them in refrigerants. And so it's clear that we as humans are the underlying cause of these climate issues. One of the most the chemical with the most greenhouse warming potential is sulfur hexafluoride, which is odorless, colorless synthetic gas. It's the most powerful greenhouse gas known. It's cheap, it's not flammable, it's widely used in the electrical business. Its levels are rising in the atmosphere. It stays in the atmosphere for 1,000 years. And when you compare it to carbon dioxide, 1 kilogram of sulfur hexafluoride has the peak global warming potential of 23,500 kilograms of CO2. And so as we move forward and are trying to deal with climate change issues, and we're looking at greenhouse gases, we're going to have to look at both the volume in which right now carbon dioxide is the leader, and look at the global warming potential in which the fluorinated hydrocarbons are the leader. Okay? Another issue that we're going to have to deal with, and again, this is the reason for doing systems, is because we tend to focus on the economy. And as the Intergovernmental Panel, Science Policy Platform said, as with climate and biodiversity, recent pandemics are a direct consequence of human activity, particularly our global and financial economic systems based on a limited paradigm that prizes economic growth at any cost. And so as long as we're measuring things in terms of economic cost, I mean, economic growth, if that's our indicator, whether or not something is good or bad, we're leaving out too much of the vital information we need to know. You know? I mean, on the whole, we think and we act in the context of the present because that's sort of our time frame. But we're on a planet that operates in a timescape from nanoseconds of chemical reactions to billions of years in geology. If you look at current economic theory, we believe in the concept of infinite growth relative to human endeavors, but we're on a planet of finite resources. You know, so we're at odds with basically how the planet itself works. We live and operate basically in economy of products. Almost everything we use is actually a product. We're very seldom are we actually handling the actual ecological resource that made the product that we're using. Okay? And so we keep coming up with this historic dichotomy of paradigms. You know, you can have an ecology or you can have an economy. You can have an economy or you can have public health. These are really false relationships because they're all dependent upon a healthy environment. There is no economy without an ecology. All businesses rely on the environment for raw materials, resources, and energy. So the only way we're going to have a long-term ecology, the only way we're going to have a long-term economy is to actually have a long-term healthy ecology. You know, we need the environment in order to have things work. And what's even more sort of odd, or shall I say perverse, is that when we talk about the economy, we're really only talking about the part that's in red. Okay? This is GDP. This is the gross domestic product. This is money that is actually changing hands. The planetary economy, according to the World Bank in 2013, was $199.9 trillion, of which $125 trillion of that was based on natural resources. This is bees pollinating food. This is plants and soils filtering water to make it safe to drink. This is trees generating oxygen and absorbing carbon dioxide. If you put costs on those things, you know, in that year, nature was doing $125 trillion worth of business. We, on the other hand, were only doing $74.9 trillion worth of business. And so when we talk about the economy, we tend only to focus on the red, and we leave out all the stuff we're actually dependent upon. We also need to keep in mind that if you look at the old conversations on sustainability, people used to talk about the three-legged stool. There's the economic domain, the social domain, the ecological domain. Now, I'll admit they're three domains, but they're not equal. Okay? To have a functional economy, you need both people and initial resources. To have the social domain, you know, we need the ecological domain. We may want the economy, but we need the ecology. And for the ecology to work, it doesn't need either us or the economics. And so, you know, clearly everything is going to be centered on how do you have the healthy economy, how do you have the healthy ecology that keeps everything else functioning? Okay. As Prince Charles says, you know, one of the gravest misconceptions of the modern age is the presumption that nature can be taken for granted and her needs ignored. Nature is, in fact, the source and the very basis of our welfare and economic prosperity, which is what that graphic was just showing you. The World Economic Forum that meets in Davos in January, in their 2019 Global Risk Report, the opening sentence was, "Is the world sleepwalking into a crisis?" And they were talking about the fact that economists are increasingly worried about environmental policy failure, that the results of inaction are becoming increasingly clear. But we just look at the rate of how fast we're losing biodiversity, what's happening with species abundance, what's happening to the human food chain, you know, that they think that the economy is totally dependent upon the environment. In their 2020 report this year, of all the things that were likely to cause a catastrophic upset into the world economy, and most likely, all of them were environmental issues. Okay? As to what was going to have the largest impact, you know, 3 of the 5 were environmental issues. In their coding system, they've got water crisis as a social issue. I think it's an environmental issue, which usually gives 4 out of 5. But it's also intriguing that, that to have a list of what people are worried about and have weapons of mass destruction not be number 1, but the failure to deal with climate be the major concern for the economists. Okay? And in fact, a study that was done also last year showed that that if environmental costs were properly accounted for, almost no company on Earth would be profitable. So the extent to which companies are making money right now, it's not about their sales, it's about how much they can discount the environment. And as the head of the San Francisco Fed said, when you put all these pieces together, it becomes pretty clear climate change is an economic issue we can't afford to ignore. Okay? And I love this quote. No matter how complex or affluent human societies are nothing but a subsystem of the biosphere, the Earth's thin veneer of life, which is ultimately run by bacteria, fungi, and green plants, which should help put us into a better frame of reference for ourselves. And next year starts the decade of ecosystem restoration at the UN. Again, because without the healthy environment, we're going to have problems with food supply, water supply, biodiversity, and all the things that we need for human development. Which intriguingly now puts the top economists in the world, top businesses, major nonprofits in agreement that the environment is crucial, that that's what we have to take care of, which functionally means that all the geniuses in the economic worlds have finally caught up with the insights of Marley's Ghost, that the common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop in the comprehensive ocean of my business. We had to think larger scale. Pope Francis, in some of his writings and some of his talks recently, has been using a Spanish quote, the translation, which is, God always forgives. Humans sometimes forgive and sometimes not. The earth never forgives. The earth, and then he says, the earth does not forgive. If we have despoiled the earth, the response will be very ugly. Okay? And in the 2018 World Economic Forum report, they talked about the fact when risk cascades to complex systems, the danger isn't of incremental damage, but of runaway collapse. Okay? Things will just fall apart very, very quickly. And if you look where we are with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, at the end of April, on average for April, we were at 416.18 parts per million. Okay? And the last time we had carbon concentrations about that level was somewhere between 3 and 5 million years ago, when the average temperature was 3.6 to 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, and we had another 32 to 65 feet of sea level. So the Pope's right. This can get very ugly very quickly, because climate change changes everything, and it does it everywhere, simultaneously and synergistically. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is this: that we've added so many people. We've right now about 7.7 billion people. We're going to 9.8 billion. It took 200,000 years of humans, modern humans. We've been around on the planet for about 200,000 years to get to a population of 2.5 billion people in 1950. Okay, but in the 100 years after that, between 1950 and 2050, we are expected to add 7.3 billion people to the planet. Okay, and that rate of acceleration and change simply requires a complete rethink and redo of how we work, how we operate, how we live, and how we're going to balance values and priorities. Okay? Because you can't run a world of close to 9.8 billion people on a philosophy of government and economy that was designed for 2.5 billion people. So, and this isn't anything that's really new. Complex systems have done this before. Complex systems, when they get to a certain size, simply need to restructure and redesign and redevelop themselves to maintain their efficiency, their effectiveness, and also their adaptability. And that's where we are. And as Albert Einstein has pointed out, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. So what we're really having to do is rethink and think in new ways how we ended up here and where is it we want to be. We're not trying to save the planet. We're really just trying to save ourselves from ourselves. And that's sort of the quandary, because we're the solution, we're the cause, we're the solution of the issues. But not enough of us at the moment really understand that, grasp that. And right now we are functionally a self-harming species because we do things without considering the environmental consequences, which come back to bite us. All the information on COVID-19, for example, is that this is a zoonotic virus, something that made the jump from animals to people, and we are seeing more of these as we encroach into new habitats for our presence. Not that the other animals haven't been there, not that the virus hasn't been there, but we're now encroaching in areas where we haven't been before, and these things are now coming to attack us. So with new thinking, we also need to understand that the past, therefore, isn't the roadmap to the future. A lot of the thinking was sort of on a static planet concept, which is not. And I suspect for many of you, who I'm going to guess are somewhere near my age, we went through a school system where the focus was, did you get the right answer? Doesn't matter what the question was, did you get the right answer? But we're now living in a time frame where this process is reversed. Are we getting the questions right? Then we can figure out what the answers are. But we got to get the question right, because we spent a lot of time in the past coming up with pretty good answers to pretty poor and ineffective questions. Okay? And so again, we need to think in terms of flow and systems. Even though our current educational methodologies and economics politics don't celebrate or celebrate individual parts as opposed to seeing whole systems, we need to make the mental shift to thinking in terms of systems. And going back to this chart, where we have carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, the fluorinated carbon gases, if you look at this, what this is really talking about, if we want to minimize the harm here, is we have to change transportation. We have to change how we do energy. We have to change how we build houses. We have to change how we measure profit in the economy. And we have to overcome our dismissal of nature and the environment. I mean, functionally, we need to change just about everything we do into a way that is in context with the planet, because what the pollution levels are telling us is that we are operating beyond the boundaries of the planet at the moment. Okay? So we're no longer witnesses to these events, we're actually causing the events. Okay? The environment simply responds to what it is that we do. We put more heat in the system, we get a result. Okay? We change where rain falls, we get a result. So we're causing this, which is to a certain extent why this is generally referred to as the Anthropocene. We're in charge. Okay? And part of the question we need to consider and look at is, are we willing to accept the responsibility that we've given ourselves? Because the lives and quality of life of our grandchildren and every other species on the planet sort of depend upon that answer. Okay? The good thing is we know how to do a lot of stuff we need to do. We already know how to build energy positive buildings, how to diversify transportation. We can do vertical indoor agriculture, we can do urban agriculture, we can do energy capture and storage, we can set up distributed energy systems. We know how to reduce food waste, we know how to reconstruct our relationship with water, we know how to landscape for life by planting trees, creating habitat, regenerating soil to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We know how to do all this stuff. But at the moment, that's being seen as an option as opposed to being understood as this is the path forward. Okay? As Pogo says, we're confronted with insurmountable opportunities. Okay? And functionally, the question becomes, not can we do these things, but will we do them? Okay? We know how to, but are we actually going to do it? So nobody can go back and make a brand new start. Anyone can start from now and make a brand new ending. Okay? Because we're all on this together. And as Martin Luther King wrote, you know, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all the others, all indirectly. Okay? This last little quote in here, I think, is fairly important, and that is, as for the future, our task really isn't to foresee it, but to enable it. Can we do things that allow the future to come? You know, from our species perspective, can we have a healthy human future with a healthy planet? Are we willing to put ourselves in a mode to operate within the context, confines, restrictions, and potentials of the planet itself? Okay? Because everything we do makes a difference, and we got to decide on a daily basis, what kind of difference do we want to make? Because functionally, we're the ones we've been waiting for. Okay? So, thank you. And I hope that you have some questions. Let me get rid of this. So.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. That's really a very fascinating way of looking at things. And in some senses, it's very obvious that things have unintended consequences. Does systems thinking boil down to being purely as simple as thinking of implications outside your realm? Or is there a way that it's, I mean, is it a difficult thing for people to learn to think in a systems thinking way?
It is possible to learn it. It's possible to do it. Originally, what happens for a lot of people is that we put diversified teams together. If you think about LEED buildings when they first started, the idea was we weren't taking architects and making them think in a systems way. What we were doing though was the construction guys, the interior designers, the landscape people, the users of the building, the architects were all at the table at the same time, you know, engaged in the conversation simultaneously, so that when decisions were made, people would say, "Oh, yes, that will work," or "No, that doesn't work," or "Do you know what the ramifications of this happen to be?" I was at one conversation, they're talking about building a new hospital here in Sarasota, and they had decided where they're going to put the bathrooms on the floor. And one of the members of the nursing staff got really upset and said, you understand that if you put the bathrooms there, it's going to cost an extra $50,000 a year. And they said, well, why? He said, because you put the bathroom so far away from the nurse's station that we now have to have an extra nurse on staff all the time, so that we have enough people who are always by the station to respond to any buzzers from the rooms. And it would have been very easy for the plumbers just to hang the pipes where they had wanted to put them, but it would have had huge ramifications. And so so either learning yourself how to think sort of beyond your boundaries, which for me was easy. My father frequently told me, that if I could just focus, I'd really amount to something. And so one of my advisors said sort of the same thing. And they would say, focus, focus, focus. And what I heard was focus, 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 because I was interested in systems and how do things connect. And so that's worked well for me, but teams also work extremely well also to get this done. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, yeah, and that's really interesting because I think people who've had multiple careers or have come through kind of different jobs, different educational systems, can often bring this broader perspective. But the idea of just bringing more people to the table is also kind of really critical. I love that. Your book was called This Spaceship Earth, and here we are partying like it's 1969, trying to get humans into space again today. The weather didn't permit it.
Right.
But
Right.
I love that concept of a spaceship because it's that sense of it's a system with a limit. There's nothing can come in or come out once you're
Right.
floating
Right.
around the earth. So how does that perspective help people think outside their own economic boundaries?
Well, I think part of it is helping first people sort of understand what their economic boundaries are, and what their, say, environmental or product footprint, happens to be, and reminding people that this is what there is. When Interface Carpet Company, Ray Anderson, when he came up with the idea of carpet tiles, one of the things that he came to realize was that most of the carpet that had ever been made still existed, but it's just in landfills. And so he got contracts to go dig up landfills to get old carpet that he could then remanufacture into the new carpet tiles. And so, because his idea was, once he understood how many resources he had to pull from the earth to make, as he said, to make a buck in his business, it was like, this makes no sense. I need to find a new way. And so, he went and said, okay, what's already available, in some form that I can skip several manufacturing stages if I just go get this trash and start using that material. And so when people run into limits, and I think one of the things that's happened in the last few years, even though people still like to use the concept of externalities, is that one company's externalities is a financial penalty to another company. And so as people start to see where the waste or the pollution from one company is bumping into their profit motive, then they seem to be more willing to have different kinds of conversations. Coca-Cola in Central America has found it easier to pay former farmers to grow trees as opposed to growing certain types of crops, cutting down trees to make farmland. And so they pay them to grow trees because the trees will trigger higher rainfall events. And are also their root structure and the soil structure also cleans up the water as well. And so they have a higher volume of water and a cleaner volume of water to deal with. So it was cheaper to have people plant trees than it was to build water treatment plants to deal with agricultural runoff. And in the long run, friendlier for the community. So, yeah.
Okay, one last question before we start bringing in a couple of other questions, because that triggered something that I had actually written down, which is, at the moment, we're seeing things spiraling down. We're seeing, the dominoes fall and all sorts of things spiraling down. But when you think from a systems thinking perspective about climate repair,
Right.
To what degree can we create a spiral up where there's synergies that healing one thing starts healing more things?
I think that is what we're going to see. I mean, that's I was attending a webinar the other day on environmental economics, and the whole focus there was the discussion of how do we use the downturn to sort of realign the the economics so that the environmental resources are now credited with their real value. I think it was last fall, the Business Roundtable redefined the role of business. And the shift was functionally taking and requiring businesses to take a long-term view as opposed to a short-term view. Because what they'd come to realize was if everybody's doing the short-term view, then what that causes is a rapid use of resources and very little thought about replenishing or resources being available in the future. And so if I now make you think about the fact, you want to be in business not just this quarter, but you want to be in business, 20 years from now, that's a very different model of thought and form of discussions you have in the boardroom. I also think that as communities come back, people are going to be looking for more local opportunities. With the shutting of some of the dairies and with one of the slaughterhouses in the area, we had some ranchers who were kind of stuck with, what am I going to do with this? What am I going to do with these cattle? And so they worked with Manatee County and the agricultural program here, and basically were able to put together qualified local butchers who could now handle the local stock of cattle to make food available to the food shelters and food banks. And so, the rancher is now, still earning an income. People still had access to food. Rocky Mountain Institute several years ago, it started, I think, this one in Portland, Oregon. There was a woman who went around to different businesses and asked them where did they order their supplies from, and then went around and found out who had those supplies locally. So, why were you sending your money so far out of our community to get something that's actually being made, half a mile away? You just didn't know that company was there. How do we help people understand who's actually in our region that can do something? And I think we're going to see more of those types of things show up, because as cities, as communities understand that with climate change, because it's going to happen sort of everywhere at the same time, your only safety valve is the resources and the inner working inside your community. We're not going to, we here in Bradenton and Manatee County, the state's not going to come help us. It may do something for Miami or Tampa or someplace like that, but we're not going to be on their list. And even at the federal level, I mean, if you're going to flood Houston, Galveston, Mobile, New Orleans, Tampa, Miami, Jacksonville, Savannah, part of Washington, D.C., part of Richmond, part of New York, part of Boston, all at the same time, there's no money for those. And so this situation is causing people to really look at, what can I build locally to, have a stronger, local, healthier community. So I think that's what we're going to be seeing happen. So,
Great. Yeah, it's certainly been a mind shift that we've seen in the last couple of months. I want to open it up to questions, and the first question is from Bob Leonard, who I know via Twitter. So it's very nice to meet you, Bob, and I know you guys know each other. So right. Bob, you're unmuted. Feel free to.
Okay. Hi, Tim.
Hey, Bob.
Good presentation. Good, buddy. Yeah. I have the luck to have been friends with you for a while, so a lot of the stuff that you covered, I've had those insights from you. One thing that was new to me, though, was reconstruct our relationship to water.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Okay. As population grows in an area, I need more water to make electricity. As population grows in an area, I need more water to provide the food supply. As more people move into an area, I need more water just for human consumption and health and hygiene. There's a very fixed amount of water in any community, and it's already overburdened and overstretched. Now, we know how to actually grow fresh water. I mean, there's we can do bioremediation of water at neighborhood scales. We can also do it at individual factory scales, where we can grow certain plants that can remove the chemicals that are coming from one production system, so that you bring your usable water in. You probably bring potable water in. You're going to use that in your manufacturing process, but then the next part is you're going to be required to clean that water and turn it back up to pretty much potability standards before it leaves your facility. And that can easily be done in a constructed greenhouse or a constructed wetland. I'm living, as you know, here in this part of Florida. Average rainfall here is about 54 inches of rain a year. And if I do the calculations, I have a water bill. We've got a really good public water utility here, but there's enough rainfall that falls on the roof of my house, the driveway, and the walkway, that if I caught that rainwater, I can meet the entire demand of our house, even with all three of us here. And so rather than taking that water and turning it into stormwater, I can actually catch it and use it as a water source, because there isn't enough water to constantly keep meeting the new demands. And one of the reasons we're going to have to start changing to agriculture from horizontal to more vertical is that horizontal agriculture uses about 70% of the available fresh water. And so if we're going to keep having more people have to grow more food, we could try to become more water efficient in a horizontal format, but we know if we go to a vertical format that we already can increase the amount of crop being grown while minimizing the amount of water being used. So it's a difference in, rather than trying to come up with trying to take an old system and really increase its efficiency, we already know what the new system is and how much more efficient it is. And so those are the kinds of things we're going to have to start thinking about. And in Florida, I could catch rainwater. When I lived in Utah, I could not catch rainwater. Rainwater was owned by the state in Utah, and so you could not get a permit to capture water falling off your roof to use. And so and that's true in a couple of New England states as well. And so we're going to have to come to a new relationship that deals with the fact that our planet circulates water. It doesn't create water. And as things get hotter, what happens is for every 1 degree centigrade the temperature goes up, we take 7% of the moisture that is in the ground and in surface water and move it to the atmosphere. That's why we see the change in rainfall events, because we're actually changing the water cycle in different areas. And so as we keep making it hotter, I mean, we're looking at predictions of up to close to 5 degrees Celsius warmer by the end of 2100. That's moving a lot of water from ground into the air. And we're dependent upon groundwater for the most part, at least in our current system. And so that's so taking that forward view and thinking about all the places that use water and how we're going to either reallocate that or figure out how to clean that stuff up. Singapore recaptures all of its stormwater and treats it to become potable water for redistribution inside Singapore, because their other water comes from a pipe system that runs through another country or another sovereign entity that is not always friendly to Singapore. And so they're always concerned about whether or not somebody's going to turn the tap off on them. And so they've developed a whole new system to be able to maximize the use and reuse of water. And we're just getting a population size where that's where we're going to have to figure out what to do, how to do it ourselves. So, yeah.
And speaking of water, the first time I saw you speak was about sea level rise in Florida, and I know it was both horrific and incredibly entertaining at the same time to just
Thank you.
kind of wrap your head around such a massive issue. So just for a final question, and then we'll wrap it up. Amelia wants to kind of ask a question around water from the Californian perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I studied water resources in grad school, so this conversation about water is really interesting to me, especially being an East Coast transplant in California. I am recently rereading a book called Cadillac Desert, and everyone should definitely read it if you haven't already. It's quite disturbing, but also very entertaining. And I have just so many questions regarding, the whole system of water distribution the West has basically built for itself at the detriment of a lot of local ecosystems to serve irrigation needs.
Right.
And the main argument around that was that a lot of the produce at the time, and still now today, was coming out of California. And our Central Valley, and so the farmers needed that water. They needed the irrigation to produce the food that was, supplying the rest of the United States. And there was all these roundabout political maneuvers that were taken to basically make that water available for farmers. And I guess my big question is just, how do we get away from that system? Because it doesn't seem, I think a lot about this book while I'm listening to your talk about how, all the dams that were built between the 1920s and 1970s are probably the biggest argument against just totally not thinking about us from a systems perspective, and just damming up all these rivers. How do we move away from this system that we're so reliant on to provide a good portion of the United States with fresh produce and agriculture?
I mean, I'm not sure I want to give you the full total answer.
That's okay. That's okay. Just your thoughts would be fine.
I myself have often wondered, what was the thinking that said, let's go to a desert and make that the major place where we're going to grow food. Just starting there is sort of an intriguing process. If you thinking about that in terms of sort of the drought that California has had of late, where there was a huge clash between, how much water should you get for agriculture versus, what was happening to the fishermen when you didn't get the water inflow into the estuaries to, have the juvenile stock of fish, be able to live and survive. And you couldn't get the salmon back upstream and things along that line. And so we're going to end up with some conversations about competing needs of water, which will probably have some impact. I want to jump to Las Vegas for a minute. One of the people who was very involved in coming up with some of the rules and regulations about how farmers or different entities owned water rights in Las Vegas has now become a major supporter of the fact that it's our water. it isn't one person's water. That we now have to deal with water as a public resource, and has changed 180 degrees from the arguments that they used to make to the conversations and the legislation they're trying to pass now. If we start to go to, well, a couple of things are going to happen if we don't make major changes, and one of which is that California will have more droughts. There will be longer lasting droughts, and agriculture will not be the power player it is in the economy because it simply isn't going to be able to generate the yield that it used to. As we diversify for food security, where bulks of food are being grown, one of the things I frequently talk about is sovereignty. If you cannot provide the primary needs for the residents of your community inside your political boundary, you really don't have sovereignty, because you're dependent upon primary needs, food, water, energy, coming from some other jurisdiction, and the other jurisdiction never has to provide it unless they want to. In Sarasota, we're at the end of the Floridian aquifer, so anybody else can use all the water they want. We only get what's left. The northern part of Florida has been in a multi-year fight with Georgia about how much water does Georgia have to let flow into Florida. And Georgia's position is, we don't have to let flow into water that which we do not want to use at the moment. We don't have to guarantee a certain amount of water there. And so we are going to see those kind of competitions show up, and the courts are going to have to get involved. But we're also going to see some of the economic collapse that'll happen. And again, as different communities after COVID now see how vulnerable they are in primary needs of being able to feed their community, and start to do more, urban or vertical indoor agriculture. The logic and the demand for produce coming from California is going to be run into some different competition. And as banks and investment funds start to say, I need to know how you are accounting for your environmental impact. I now need you to put your externalities on the books as you tell me what your profit is. That's also going to start changing the rules as to how much agriculture you're going to do. The fact that the vast majority of tomatoes and tomato sauce that show up on pizzas in the United States, and pizzas are big in the US, that those tomatoes are all coming, basically they're all coming from California, which is not only moving a lot of tomatoes, using a lot of fossil fuel to move those tomatoes, it's also exporting a tremendous amount of water. If you look at how much water it takes to grow a tomato, there are just going to be some new issues of logic that start to fall into the business accounting that say, no, we can't do that and still be in business 20 years from now, or our profit margins are going to get cut so much by doing this that we won't have the same investor support and the same investor basis. And I think that's really where the change is going to come. I don't think telling farmers, we're going to change your water bill, or we're going to shut off the pipes, is going to be an appropriate way to resolve this. But this is one of those issues where the combination of competing markets, one person's externality becomes a limit to somebody else, is going to be an issue. As water shortage becomes more prominent, the ability for public water supplies to deal with the agricultural runoff and the cost of dealing with that to maintain clean water issues is going to become more of a burden. There's going to be a whole change in how water gets accounted for in its economics. And I think that's where we'll start to see how people want to play. I mean, there are different water rules west of the Mississippi than there are east of the Mississippi, but I think in most cases, citizens having access to potable water, is going to be the driver of what the final outcome, happens to be. Yeah.
Thank you. That was really great. We're at 10 after the hour, so we kind of snuck over a little because it's a deeply interesting topic. We did have a question in from Jeannie Linham about, she works for a large company and is struggling to share a comprehensive vision of an ethical future. I know you've got a newsletter. I know this deck has got some really interesting things, but any quick tips on that, and then we'll let everyone get back to their evenings. And
there are probably two groups I suggest that she looks at. I mean, there's a newsletter coming out from Ethical Corporation, and it also has a series of webinars and conferences where people are having those conversations about how to do that. And the other one is it's CASE, C-A-S-S-E, and what does it,
okay.
Self-regulating or self-sustaining economy is what the last part of the phrase is about. I can send you that stuff so you can forward it on to her.
And what we'll do is we'll take this video and put it into a blog post. So we'll also attach any of those recommendations to that or put links through it. Thank you so much for staying up quite past your bedtime in Florida and joining us on the other coast.
Thank you very much. So thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Bye.
Bye.